When my brother Ian called me back home to Orkney, I didn't think twice about it. He never called for help unless things were really bad. The family farm had always struggled, but he sounded desperate this time. Crops were failing faster than we could plant them, and the livestock were dying off, their bodies twisted and rotting from some unknown blight. Even our closest neighbors, the Stewarts, had packed up and left without so much as a goodbye. I made the long journey from Edinburgh, my heart heavy with worry, and arrived at the farm on a grey, blustery afternoon. The wind howled across the fields, carrying the smell of salt and decay from the nearby sea. As I stepped out of the car, Ian met me at the gate, looking thinner and more tired than I'd ever seen him. His face was pale, and his eyes had dark circles beneath them, like he hadn't slept in days. "Thanks for coming, Callum," he said, his voice raw with exhaustion. "Of course," I replied, clapping him on the back. "You sounded like you could use some help." Ian's mouth twisted into a grim smile. Help, or a miracle? He led me to the barn, where the stench of death hit me like a wall. A half-dozen sheep lay scattered in the straw, their bodies bloated and blackened, their mouths frozen open in silent screams. My stomach churned, and I pressed a hand to my nose. "What the hell happened?" I asked, my voice muffled. Ian shook his head, his expression grim. "I don't know. It started a few weeks ago. The crops turned to rot overnight, and the animals. Christ, Callum, it's like something's poisoning the land." We walked out into the fields, where the wheat and barley should have been tall and golden. Instead, they were shriveled and black, the stalks crumbling to ash at the slightest touch. The sky was overcast, heavy with clouds that threatened rain, but it felt more like the calm before a storm. "You've called a vet, right?" I asked. "3, Ian replied. "None of them could figure it out. And it's not just the farm. People in town are getting sick, too. Rashes, fevers, even the fish are dying in the harbor." A chill crept up my spine. It didn't sound like any disease I'd ever heard of. "Has anyone seen anything?" I asked carefully. Ian's eyes darted to the horizon, where the sea met the sky in a blur of grey. "They don't want to talk about it," he said, lowering his voice. "But there's been whispers. People claim they've seen something in the mist, out by the shore. A monster." I swallowed hard. We'd grown up hearing the old stories, tales of sea witches, kelpies, and things far worse. But those were just that, stories. Weren't they? "Come on," Ian said, pulling me back toward the house. "It's getting dark, and you don't want to be out here after sunset." That night, the wind screamed around the farmhouse, rattling the windows and making the old walls groan. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The smell of rot seemed to cling to everything, and every creak and whisper made my skin crawl. Just as I was finally drifting off, a sound cut through the wind, a low, rasping wheeze, like something struggling to breathe. My eyes flew open, and I strained to listen. There it was again, closer now. A wet, sucking noise, as if the earth itself was gasping for air. Heart pounding, I crept to the window and pulled back the curtain. The moon had broken through the clouds, casting a pale, ghostly light over the fields. And there, moving through the rotting wheat, was something. My breath caught in my throat. It was huge, standing at least 12 feet tall. The creature had the body of a horse, its muscles rippling and bare, skinless, with red, raw flesh glistening in the moonlight. The veins stood out like dark ropes, pulsing with black ichor. But worse than the horser's body was the thing attached to it, a human torso fused grotesquely to the horser's back, also skinless, with long, sinewy arms that ended in clawed hands. Its head lolled on its shoulders, and its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, burning with hatred. The Nuckelavee. I stumbled back from the window, bile rising in my throat. The creature let out a low, wet groan, and I realized it was sniffing the air, its nostrils flaring. It turned its eyeless gaze toward the farmhouse, and I knew it sensed us. Sensed the life that had dared to linger on its cursed land. I ran to Ian's room, throwing the door open. "Get up," I hissed, my voice shaking. It's here. Ian shot up, his eyes wild with fear. You saw it? Yes, I said, grabbing his arm. We need to go. Now. We stumbled down the stairs, not even bothering to put on our shoes. The wind whipped at us as we burst out of the front door, and I could hear the Nuckelavee's heavy footsteps, the sickening squelch of its hooves dragging through the mud. It can't cross running water, Ian said, his voice tight with panic. We have to get to the creek. The creek was only a few hundred yards away, but every step felt like an eternity. The ground seemed to suck at our feet, slowing us down, and I could hear the Nuckelavee behind us, its breathing growing louder, wetter, full of rage. Run, Callum! Ian shouted, shoving me forward. I glanced back and nearly tripped. The Nuckelavee was close, its claws reaching, its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. I could see the steam rising off its raw, pulsing flesh, and the smell, God, the smell, was suffocating, a stench of rot and decay that burned my lungs. We reached the creek just as the Nuckelavee lunged. Ian grabbed my arm and yanked me across the narrow stream, the cold water splashing up to my knees. The Nuckelavee skidded to a halt at the edge, its claws gouging deep into the mud. It reared back, letting out a scream that sounded like 1,000 souls being torn apart. The water, our only protection, shimmered in the moonlight, and the creature thrashed in fury. It paced back and forth, its eyes blazing, but it couldn't cross. Ian and I stood there, gasping for breath, clutching each other, until the Nuckelavee finally retreated, melting into the shadows of the rotting fields. We didn't move until dawn, when the first rays of sunlight chased away the last of the mist. Our legs were numb, our clothes soaked, but we were alive. The Nuckelavee was gone, for now. Ian packed up what little we had left, and we drove away from the farm, leaving the land to rot, leaving behind generations of memories. The farm had been our family's for over 100 years, but some curses are too old, too powerful to fight. Even now, back in the city, I can't forget the sight of that creature. The way its flesh gleamed in the moonlight, the way it smelled of death and disease. Sometimes, when the wind howls, I hear that wet, gasping breath, and I know the Nuckelavee is still out there, haunting the land, bringing ruin to anyone foolish enough to cross its path. Some legends, I've learned, are more than just stories. Some monsters are real, and they are older and hungrier than we could ever imagine.